With his wife dying in 48 hours until the bank seized everything, John Patterson spent his family's last $5 on a skeletal horse wrapped in chains. Nobody at that auction could have predicted the condemned giant would become their only salvation. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust clouds rolled across the barren fields of the Patterson Ranch like ghosts searching for something that had long since disappeared. John Patterson stood at the edge of his property, his weathered hands gripping the fence post so tightly his knuckles had turned white. At 42 years old, he looked closer to 60. The relentless sun had carved deep lines into his face, and his frame, once strong and capable, had withered to something barely recognizable. His shirt hung loose on his shoulders, and his belt had been tightened to the last hole, yet his pants still threatened to slip down his narrow hips. Behind him, the small farmhouse that had been in his family for 3 generations stood silent and haunted. The paint had peeled away years ago, the porch sagged dangerously on one side, and several windows were cracked or missing entirely, covered with whatever scraps of wood or cardboard John could find. Inside that house, his wife Martha lay on their bed, too weak to stand for more than a few minutes at a time. The illness had come on slowly at first, just a persistent cough and some fatigue, but over the past 6 months it had consumed her like a wildfire. The doctor in town had given them a diagnosis that required treatments they couldn't afford, medicines that cost more than John made in 3 months of hard labor. Their 2 children, Emma and James, tried to be strong, but John could see the fear in their eyes every morning when they woke up. Emma, just 14, had taken over most of the household duties, cooking what little food they had and caring for her mother while John worked from sunrise to sunset, trying to keep the ranch from completely falling apart. James, only 10, helped his father in the fields, his small hands blistered and raw from work that should have been done by grown men with proper equipment. The ranch had been dying for years. First came the drought that lasted 3 summers, turning the once green pastures into cracked earth where nothing would grow. Then the bank had come calling, demanding payments on loans John's father had taken out before he passed. John had sold off the cattle one by one, watching his herd dwindle from 50 head to 30, then to 10, and finally to nothing. He'd sold the tractors, the plows, everything of value. The chickens had stopped laying when there wasn't enough feed, and eventually they'd eaten the chickens too. Now, on this scorching afternoon in late August, John Patterson had exactly $5.37 to his name. He'd counted it 3 times that morning, spreading the crumpled bills and handful of coins on the kitchen table, while Martha watched from the bedroom doorway, her eyes hollow with worry. $5.37 stood between his family and complete destitution. The next bank payment was due in 2 weeks, and he was short by nearly $300. Without that payment, they would lose everything, be thrown off the land that generations of Pattersons had worked and died for. Martha had whispered to him that morning, her voice barely audible, asking him to please try one more time, to find some way, any way, to save their family. The children had heard her plea, and the weight of their silent, desperate hope pressed down on John's shoulders like a physical burden. He'd nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat, and had walked out to survey the land one more time, searching for anything he might have missed, any resource he could tap, any miracle that might present itself. The town of Millbrook was 8 miles away, and John knew he should probably walk there to conserve the last few drops of gasoline in his old truck, but his pride wouldn't let him arrive on foot. He climbed into the battered Ford that had been his father's, coaxing the engine to life with a prayer and a pump of the gas pedal. The truck coughed and sputtered, but finally caught, and John pointed it toward town, his mind racing through impossible scenarios. Maybe old Mr. Henderson at the feed store would extend him credit one more time. Maybe the church would have some kind of emergency fund. Maybe. Every possibility seemed more desperate than the last, but John Patterson was a man who had run out of options, except for faith and whatever stubborn determination still burned in his chest. As he drove down the dusty county road, he passed other farms in various states of decay. The drought had hit everyone hard, but most of his neighbors had savings to fall back on, or relatives in the city who could help, or jobs they could take in town to supplement their income. John had none of these advantages. He'd poured everything into the ranch, believing that hard work and dedication would be enough. He'd been wrong. The truck rattled over the cattle guard at the edge of his property, and John glanced in the rearview mirror at the land behind him. Somewhere in that house, Martha was probably sitting by the window, watching him leave, praying for a miracle. Emma would be making lunch from the last of their canned vegetables and the stale bread from 3 days ago. James would be trying to fix the broken fence on the north pasture with wire and hope, because they had no money for proper materials. John tightened his grip on the steering wheel and pressed harder on the accelerator, $5.37. It wasn't much, but it was all he had, and he'd be damned if he'd give up without exhausting every last possibility. The main street of Millbrook looked like a ghost town. Half the storefronts were boarded up, victims of the same economic devastation that had ravaged the surrounding farmland. John parked in front of Henderson's Feed and Supply, taking a deep breath before stepping out into the oppressive heat. Inside, the store was dim and cool, and Mr. Henderson looked up from behind the counter with the expression that told John everything he needed to know before he even opened his mouth. Henderson was a good man, had known John's father, had extended credit more times than was probably wise for a small business owner. But when John approached and started to explain his situation once again, Henderson just shook his head slowly, his weathered face full of genuine regret. He couldn't do it anymore, he explained. His own suppliers were demanding payment, and he had his own family to think about. The words were kind but final, and John nodded his understanding, thanking the old man before turning to leave. He tried the bank next, though he knew it was pointless. The manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually disapproving expression, barely let John finish his request before denying it. The bank had been more than patient, he said, and there were policies, procedures, regulations that couldn't be bent no matter how sympathetic one might feel. John left with his hat in his hands, and his hope dwindling to almost nothing. The church office was closed. A handwritten sign explaining that Reverend Thomas was visiting sick parishioners in the next county and wouldn't return until the following week. John stood on the church steps for a long moment, staring at that sign, feeling the weight of defeat settling over him like a heavy blanket. He'd tried everything. There was nothing left. He was walking back to his truck, his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the dusty ground, when he heard the commotion coming from the edge of town, voices raised in excitement, the sound of hooves on hard-packed earth, the distinctive cadence of an auctioneer's rapid-fire patter. John's first instinct was to keep walking, to go home and face his family with the truth that he'd failed them. But something made him turn toward the sound, maybe just curiosity, maybe the desperate hope that he might find some opportunity he'd overlooked. The livestock auction yard was crowded with ranchers and dealers, all gathered around a series of pens and corrals where various animals were being sold off. John recognized several faces in the crowd, men who'd been luckier than him, or smarter, or just had better land that hadn't been quite as devastated by the drought. He stayed on the outskirts, watching as horses, cattle, and even some goats were paraded before the bidders. The prices being called out made John's heart sink further. Even the scrawniest animals were going for amounts that seemed astronomical compared to the few dollars wadded up in his pocket. He was about to turn away when he noticed a commotion at the far end of the yard, behind the main auction area. A small group had gathered around something, and their voices carried a mixture of disgust and pity. John moved closer, weaving through the crowd until he could see what had drawn their attention. In a small pen separated from the others stood the most pitiful horse he'd ever seen. It was a massive draft horse, probably a Belgian or Percheron mix, with a coat that might once have been a beautiful chestnut, but was now matted with dirt and grime. The animal was painfully thin, ribs visible through its dull coat, and its head hung low as if it no longer had the strength to lift it. But what shocked John most were the heavy chains wrapped around the horse's legs and neck, thick industrial chains that seemed designed more for restraining a dangerous criminal than an animal. A heavy-set man in a stained cowboy hat stood near the pen, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt and explaining to anyone who would listen that the horse had belonged to a logging company that had gone bankrupt. The animal had been used to pull heavy loads through rough terrain, worked nearly to death, and when the company folded, it had been abandoned along with the rest of the equipment. The man had acquired it along with some other assets, but he had no use for a broken-down draft horse and just wanted it gone. Someone in the crowd asked how much he wanted for it, and the man laughed, a harsh sound without humor. He'd take anything, he said. $5, $10, whatever someone would give him just to haul it away. Otherwise, he was calling the rendering plant in the morning. The crowd murmured, but no one stepped forward. A horse in that condition wasn't worth the cost of feeding it, let alone the veterinary care it would need. It was more merciful to let it be put down. John found himself moving closer to the pen, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The horse sensed his approach and lifted its head slightly, and for just a moment their eyes met. In those dark, pain-filled eyes, John saw something that struck him to his core. It wasn't just suffering he saw there, but a desperate, fading will to survive. This animal hadn't given up, not completely, even though it had every reason to surrender. He thought of Martha lying in their bed, fighting her illness with the same desperate determination he thought of Emma and James, still hoping, despite everything, that their father would find a way to save them. He looked at this broken, chained creature and saw his own reflection, saw his family's struggle mirrored in those haunted eyes. Before John could think about what he was doing, before rational thought could stop him, he heard his own voice calling out to the man with the tobacco-stained teeth he'd take the horse. $5. The man turned, surprised, then broke into a grin that showed more gaps than teeth. He spit again and nodded, already reaching for the pen's gate as if afraid John might change his mind. The small crowd that had gathered turned to stare at John, and he could see the judgment in their faces. Old Pete Morrison, who owned the ranch 3 miles north of the Patterson place, shook his head slowly and muttered something to the man standing next to him. A younger rancher, someone John didn't know well, laughed outright and made a comment about throwing good money after bad, but John barely heard them. He was already pulling the crumpled bills from his pocket, counting out 5 singles with hands that trembled slightly. The transaction took less than a minute. The man took John's money without ceremony, shoved it into his shirt pocket, and handed over a length of rope that served as a makeshift lead. The chains, he explained with a shrug, came with the horse. He didn't have the keys and didn't particularly care. That was John's problem now. He wished John luck in a tone that suggested he thought John would need a miracle more than luck, then walked away, counting his $5 as if he'd just made the deal of the century. John stood alone at the pen now, the rope in his hand, staring at the enormous animal that he'd just purchased with literally the last money he had to his name. The horse hadn't moved, still standing with its head lowered, those heavy chains wrapped around its legs making a soft clinking sound whenever it shifted its weight. Up close, the animal was even more imposing than John had realized. Even in its emaciated state, it stood at least 17 hands high, and its hooves were the size of dinner plates. This was a working horse bred for power and endurance, capable of pulling loads that would break smaller animals. John approached slowly, speaking in a low, calm voice, the way his father had taught him to speak to frightened animals. The horse's ear twitched, acknowledging his presence, but it didn't lift its head. When John was close enough, he reached out carefully and placed his hand on the horse's neck. The coat was rough and dirty, but beneath it he could feel the warmth of living flesh, the slow, steady beat of a heart that refused to stop. Despite everything this creature had endured, something shifted inside John in that moment. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words even if someone had asked. But standing there with his hand on that broken, chained animal, he felt a connection that transcended logic or reason. This horse was a survivor, just like him. It had been worked to the breaking point, abandoned, left to die, but something in it still fought to live. John recognized that fight because he carried the same battle within himself every single day. The practical part of his mind screamed at him that he'd just made the stupidest decision of his life. He'd spent his family's last $5 on a dying horse that would probably be dead within a week. He had no way to feed it, no resources to care for it, and now he didn't even have enough money left for gas to get home. But another part of him, a deeper, more instinctive part, whispered that somehow this was right, that this seemingly insane purchase was exactly what he was supposed to do. Getting the horse to his truck proved to be a challenge that John hadn't fully anticipated. The animal could barely walk, its legs trembling with each step, and the chains added weight that made every movement an exercise in agony. John had to stop every few feet, letting the horse rest, speaking to it in that same calm, steady voice, encouraging it to keep going. People watched as they made their slow, painful progress through the auction yard, and John could feel their eyes on him, could sense their mixture of pity and derision. The truck bed wasn't designed to transport a horse, especially not one this size, but John had no other option. He lowered the tailgate and after nearly 20 minutes of coaxing and encouragement, managed to get the horse to step up into the bed. The truck's suspension groaned under the weight, settling lower on its axles, and John sent up a quick prayer that the old Ford would hold together for the 8-mile journey home. He secured the rope to hooks on the side of the truck bed, then climbed into the cab. His hands were shaking as he turned the key, and for a terrible moment, the engine just clicked uselessly. But on the second try, it caught. Coughing to life with a cloud of blue smoke, John sat there for a moment, his forehead resting against the steering wheel, reality crashing down on him. What had he done? How was he going to explain this to Martha, to the children? He had no answers, only the bone-deep certainty that he couldn't have walked away from that horse any more than he could have walked away from his own family. Sometimes, John thought as he put the truck in gear and began the slow drive home, faith wasn't about understanding why you did something. It was about trusting that there was a reason, even when that reason remained hidden in the darkness of an uncertain future. The drive back to the ranch felt longer than the journey into town. John kept the truck at a crawl, acutely aware of the precious cargo in the bed behind him. Every bump in the road made him wince, imagining the horse struggling to maintain its balance on those weakened legs. He glanced in the rearview mirror constantly, checking on the animal, and what he saw both broke his heart and strengthened his resolve. The horse stood as steady as it could, its head still lowered, but it hadn't fallen, it was holding on. As the miles passed, John's mind raced through everything he'd need to do once they got home. The old barn still stood, though it leaked in 3 places and the door hung crooked on its hinges. He'd have to clear out the accumulated junk and debris, make a space where the horse could rest. There was an old water trough that might still hold water if he patched the crack in its side. But feed, that was the real problem. He had nothing to give this animal, no hay, no grain, nothing but some dried grass he could cut from the edges of the property where the drought hadn't completely killed everything. The weight of what he'd done began to press down on him with increasing force. He'd spent his last $5, money his family desperately needed, on an animal that might not survive the night. What kind of man did that? What kind of father? Martha needed medicine, the children needed food, and he'd bought a dying horse. The rational part of his mind screamed that he was a fool, that he'd let emotion override good sense, that he'd failed his family in the worst possible way. But then he'd think about those eyes, about the way the horse had looked at him with that mixture of pain and hope, and something in him insisted that this was right. He couldn't explain it, couldn't justify it with logic or reason, but he felt it in his bones. This horse was supposed to be with him. There was a purpose to this that he couldn't yet see. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when John finally turned onto the rutted dirt road that led to his property. From a distance, he could see Emma standing on the porch, her hand shading her eyes as she watched his approach. Even from here, he could sense her tension, her desperate hope that he was returning with good news, with some solution to their impossible situation. As the truck drew closer and Emma could make out what was in the bed, her expression shifted from hope to confusion. By the time John pulled to a stop in front of the house, both Emma and young James had come down from the porch, staring at the enormous chained horse with wide eyes. The screen door creaked open and Martha appeared, leaning heavily against the door frame, wrapped in a faded quilt despite the heat. John climbed out of the cab slowly, suddenly unable to meet his family's eyes. The silence stretched out, heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, James broke it, his young voice filled with wonder rather than judgment. "Dad, is that really a horse? It's so big." The boy moved closer to the truck, peering up at the animal with the innocent curiosity of childhood. Not yet understanding the implications of its presence, Emma, older and more aware of their situation, stood frozen, her eyes moving from the horse to her father and back again. John could see her trying to process what this meant, trying to understand why her father would bring home another mouth to feed when they could barely feed themselves. But she didn't speak, waiting for him to explain. It was Martha who finally asked the question that hung in the air. Her voice was weak but steady, carrying across the dusty yard. "John, what have you done?" There was no anger in her tone, only a deep weariness, a recognition that something irrevocable had occurred. John finally looked up, meeting his wife's eyes across the distance. The words came slowly, each one weighted with the knowledge that he was confessing to what might be the worst decision of his life. He told them about the auction, about finding the horse chained and abandoned, about the $5 that was all he had left in the world. He tried to explain the connection he'd felt, the certainty that had overwhelmed his rational mind, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. When he finished, the silence returned. Martha's face was unreadable, and Emma looked as if she might cry. But then something unexpected happened. James walked right up to the truck bed and reached up his small hand toward the horse. "It's okay, boy," the child said softly. "You're home now. We'll take care of you." The horse, which had stood motionless throughout the entire exchange, slowly lifted its massive head. Its eyes found James, and for a long moment, boy and horse regarded each other. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a large creature, the horse lowered its head further, bringing it within reach of James's outstretched hand. The boy's fingers touched the horse's nose, and something passed between them, something wordless but profound. Martha saw it too. From her place on the porch, even in her weakened state, she witnessed that moment of connection. Her expression softened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone. "Bring him to the barn, John. We'll figure out the rest." Those words released something in John's chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His wife, sick as she was, understood. Maybe she didn't approve. Maybe she thought he was crazy, but she wasn't going to fight him on this. That small mercy felt like a gift he didn't deserve. Getting the horse down from the truck proved even more difficult than loading it had been. The animal's legs were trembling badly now. Whether from exhaustion or the strain of the journey, John couldn't tell. It took nearly half an hour of gentle coaxing, with both John and Emma supporting the horse as best they could, before it finally stepped down onto solid ground, The chains clinked with every movement, a constant reminder of the abuse this creature had suffered. James ran ahead to the barn, pushing open the crooked door and clearing a path through the accumulated debris. John led the horse slowly across the yard, matching his pace to the animal's labored steps. Each footfall seemed to cost the horse tremendous effort, and more than once John was certain it would collapse. But somehow it kept moving, kept putting one hoof in front of the other, driven by some inner reserve of strength that refused to be extinguished. The barn was dim and musty, smelling of old hay and years of neglect. But it was shelter, and right now that was all John could offer. He led the horse to the largest stall, one that had once housed his father's prize mare years ago. The stall was dusty but structurally sound, and Emma had already begun spreading what little clean straw they had across the floor. Once the horse was inside the stall, it immediately sank down, its legs folding beneath it as it lay on its side with a deep, shuddering breath. The chains spread out around it like the bars of a prison it carried everywhere. John knelt beside the massive head, running his hand along the horse's neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath his palm. "Rest now," he whispered. "You're safe here." Emma appeared at his side with an old bucket filled with water from the pump. Together they held it near the horse's mouth, and after a moment the animal's tongue appeared, lapping weakly at the water. It drank for several minutes, pausing occasionally to rest, then drank again. When it had finished, it laid its head back down on the straw, those dark eyes closing as if the simple act of drinking had exhausted what little energy remained. John stood, his knees creaking, and looked at his daughter. Emma's face was smudged with dirt, and her eyes were red-rimmed, but she met his gaze with a steadiness that made him proud. "We need to get those chains off," she said simply. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, and John nodded. The chains were secured with heavy padlocks, industrial grade, the kind used in logging operations to secure valuable equipment. John had no key and no way to pick the locks. His toolbox yielded a pair of rusty bolt cutters that looked laughably inadequate against the thick chain links, but it was all he had. He positioned the cutters against the first link and squeezed with all his strength. Nothing happened. He tried again and again, his hands cramping and his arms shaking with effort. James brought him a piece of metal pipe to use as a lever, extending the handles of the bolt cutters. With Emma holding one side and John pulling on the pipe, they strained together. The metal groaned, resisting, and then suddenly, with a sharp crack that echoed through the barn, the link gave way. The chain fell loose, and both John and Emma stumbled backward from the sudden release of pressure. They repeated the process on each chain, working methodically despite their exhaustion. The horse lay still throughout, occasionally opening its eyes to watch them but otherwise conserving its strength. Each time a chain fell away, John felt a small surge of satisfaction. These symbols of captivity and abuse, one by one, were being removed. The last chain was wrapped around the horse's neck, and it was the heaviest of all John could see, where it had rubbed the hide raw, leaving patches of exposed flesh that had scabbed over. His jaw tightened with anger at whoever had done this, at the casual cruelty that would treat any living creature this way. This final chain took them nearly 20 minutes to break, but when it finally fell away with a dull thud against the stall floor, John felt as if they'd accomplished something significant. The horse shifted slightly, as if testing its new freedom, but didn't try to stand. Without the chains, it looked somehow smaller, more vulnerable, just a sick and starving animal that needed help desperately. John gathered up the chains, their combined weight surprising him as he dragged them out of the stall. He threw them in a pile outside the barn, wanting them as far from the horse as possible. When he returned, Martha was standing at the stall door, supporting herself against the frame. She'd made the walk from the house alone, determined to see the horse up close. John moved to help her, but she waved him off, her attention fixed on the animal. She watched it for a long moment, her expression thoughtful, then looked at her husband. "What are you going to name him?" she asked. John hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been so focused on just getting the horse home and settled that the question of a name hadn't occurred to him. He looked at the horse, this massive creature that had somehow survived horrors he could only imagine, that had been chained and broken, but not destroyed. A name came to him, sudden and certain. Goliath, he said softly. His name is Goliath. Martha nodded slowly, a small smile touching her pale lips. Goliath, the giant who was brought low but refused to fall completely. She reached out and placed her hand on John's arm. You did the right thing, John. I don't know how I know that, but I do. That night, after helping Martha back to the house and getting the children settled for bed, John returned to the barn with a kerosene lamp. He couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to be near the horse to make sure it survived the night. He found an old blanket and made himself as comfortable as possible on a pile of hay just outside Goliath's stall, where he could watch the rise and fall of the animal's breathing. The hours passed slowly. Goliath slept fitfully, occasionally stirring with soft groans that spoke of deep pain. Several times John got up to check on him, to make sure he was still breathing, to offer water that the horse sometimes accepted and sometimes refused. As the night deepened and the world outside fell silent except for the crickets and distant coyotes, John found himself talking to Goliath in a low voice, telling him about the ranch, about his family, about all the things that had gone wrong and all the hopes he still carried despite everything. I don't know why I bought you, John admitted into the darkness. Lord knows it was probably the stupidest thing I've ever done. We can barely feed ourselves, and here I am with a horse that needs more care than I can give. But when I saw you in that pen, all chained up and ready to die, I saw myself. I saw my family. I saw everyone who's ever been beaten down by life but refuses to give up completely. Goliath's ear twitched, the only sign that he might be listening. John continued, his voice raw with emotion. My wife is dying. The doctors say she needs treatments we can't afford. My kids are going hungry, trying to be brave, trying not to let me see how scared they are. I'm about to lose everything my family built over 3 generations, and instead of finding a solution, I spent our last $5 on you. He laughed, a sound without humor. People will say I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. But you know what? When I touched you, when I looked in your eyes, something told me this was right, that somehow, some way, this is part of a plan I can't see yet. My daddy used to say that faith means trusting in things you can't understand, believing even when believing seems foolish. The night wore on, and sometime before dawn, John fell into an uneasy sleep. He dreamed of his father, standing in the green pastures the ranch had once boasted, telling him that the land would provide if he just had patience. He dreamed of Martha, as she'd been when they first married, strong and laughing, dancing with him at the county fair. He dreamed of chains breaking and giants rising, though when he woke he couldn't remember the details, only the feeling of hope they'd left behind. The morning sun streaming through the barn's cracks woke him, and John sat up with a start. His back aching from the uncomfortable sleeping position, he immediately looked toward Goliath's stall, and his heart leaped when he saw the horse was awake and incredibly standing. The animal was shaky, his legs trembling with the effort. But he was on his feet. John approached slowly, speaking softly. Good morning, big fellow. You made it through the night. Goliath turned his massive head toward John, and those dark eyes seemed clearer somehow, more alert than they'd been the day before. It was a small change, barely noticeable, but it filled John with a surge of hope that felt almost painful in its intensity. Emma appeared in the barn doorway carrying 2 buckets, one with water and one with something else. She'd been up before dawn, John realized with a pang of guilt. While he'd been sleeping, his 14-year-old daughter had been working. She set the buckets down and explained that she'd made a mash from some old oats she'd found in the back of the pantry. mixing them with water to make them easier for Goliath to digest. It wasn't much, but it was something. Goliath sniffed at the bucket Emma offered, then began to eat slowly, carefully, as if his stomach had forgotten how to process food. John and Emma watched in silence as he finished every bit of the mash, then drank deeply from the water bucket. When he was done, he lifted his head and looked at them both, and John could have sworn he saw gratitude in that gaze. Over the next few days, a routine developed. John would wake before dawn and go straight to the barn, checking on Goliath, cleaning his stall, offering what little food and water they could spare. Emma helped whenever she could, bringing meals she'd prepared from their dwindling supplies. Even James contributed, sitting in the stall and talking to Goliath for hours, his childish chatter seeming to soothe the horse in ways that surprised them all. Martha, too weak to make the journey to the barn more than once a day, would sit on the porch and watch John as he worked. Sometimes he'd catch her looking toward the barn with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between worry and wonder. Goliath improved, but slowly. Each day he seemed marginally stronger, able to stand for longer periods, eating a little more, moving with slightly less pain, but he was still far from healthy, still dangerously underweight, still bearing the scars of his abuse. Meanwhile, the reality of their situation continued to press down on the Patterson family with increasing weight. The bank payment deadline loomed closer with each passing day, and John had exhausted every possible avenue for raising the money. He'd swallowed his pride and asked for help from neighbors, only to be turned away by people facing their own hardships. He'd tried to find work in town, any work, but jobs were scarce and his reputation as a failing rancher preceded him. One afternoon, almost a week after bringing Goliath home, John sat at the kitchen table with Martha. She'd insisted on getting out of bed for this conversation, understanding that what they needed to discuss required them to face each other honestly. The children were outside, giving their parents privacy for what both knew would be a difficult talk. Martha spoke first, her voice steady despite its weakness. "We need to make a decision, John. The bank will be here in 5 days. We don't have the money, and we're not going to get it. We need to prepare the children for what's coming." She reached across the table and took his hand. "We need to decide where we'll go when we lose this place." John couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. The thought of telling Emma and James that they were losing their home, that he'd failed to protect them, that everything their grandfather and great-grandfather had built would be taken away. It was almost more than he could bear. He'd spent every waking moment for weeks trying to find a solution, and he'd come up empty. The $5 he'd spent on Goliath felt like a lead weight in his chest, a constant reminder of his failure to prioritize properly. As if reading his thoughts, Martha squeezed his hand. "Stop it, John. I can see what you're thinking, and you need to stop. Buying that horse wasn't wrong. I've watched you these past few days, watched how caring for Goliath has given you a reason to get up every morning. You were drowning in despair, and that horse threw you a lifeline. Don't you dare regret it now." John looked at his wife, this woman who'd stood by him through everything, who was fighting her own battle with illness while still trying to carry his burdens. "But Martha, if I'd saved that $5, if I'd been more practical, more sensible—" "Then what?" Martha interrupted gently. $5 wouldn't have saved us, John. The problems we're facing are so much bigger than that. You can't blame yourself for one moment of compassion in the middle of all this hardship." She paused, taking a labored breath. "Besides, I think that horse is going to surprise us. Call it intuition, call it faith, call it a dying woman's delusion if you want, but I believe Goliath came to us for a reason." That evening, as John was finishing his work in the barn, he heard the sound of a vehicle coming up the drive. His heart sank when he recognized Pete Morrison's pickup truck. Pete was a successful rancher, one of the few in the area who'd managed to weather the drought without losing everything. He was also a straight talker, not known for social calls. John stepped out of the barn as Pete climbed down from his truck, his boots kicking up dust in the fading sunlight. "Evening, Pete," John said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "John." Pete nodded, then got straight to the point, as was his way. "Heard you bought yourself a draft horse at the auction last week. Big Belgian, half dead, covered in chains. That true?" John felt his defenses rise. "It's true. Horse is in the barn if you want to see him." Pete surprised him by nodding and walking toward the barn. John followed, uncertain what this visit was about. Inside, Goliath stood in his stall, and even in the dim light, John could see that the horse looked better than he had a week ago. His coat, though still dull, had been brushed clean of the worst dirt. His ribs were still visible, but less prominently. He held his head higher now, with a dignity that spoke of his bloodlines. Pete stood at the stall door for a long moment, studying Goliath with the practiced eye of someone who'd worked with horses his entire life. Finally, he spoke. "I'll be damned. You got him standing, got some weight on him. Didn't think that was possible." He turned to John. "What are you planning to do with him?" John shrugged, confused by the question. "Keep him alive, I guess. Get him healthy if I can. Hadn't thought much beyond that." Pete nodded slowly, then said something that made John's heart skip a beat. "I need a horse like this. Big, strong, good for heavy work. I've got contracts to haul timber out of rough terrain, jobs that require a draft horse with the right temperament and strength. Problem is, horses like that are expensive, and the ones available are either too young or too old." He paused, looking back at Goliath. "But this one, if you can get him healthy, he'd be perfect." John's mind raced. "Pete, I appreciate the interest, but I'm not looking to sell Goliath." "I'm not talking about buying him," Pete said. "I'm talking about leasing him. You get him healthy, I'll pay you $50 a day for his work. Good timber hauling work, nothing that'll hurt him. And I'll provide all his feed and care on the days he's working for me." $50 a day. The number echoed in John's mind like a prayer answered. 2 days of work would cover the bank payment. A week would put food on the table and medicine in Martha's cabinet. A month would change everything. But he looked at Goliath, still recovering, still weak, and the hope that had flared in his chest flickered with uncertainty. "Pete, I appreciate the offer more than you know. But Goliath isn't ready for that kind of work. He's still recovering, still gaining his strength back. I won't put him at risk, not after everything he's been through." Pete nodded, respect showing in his weathered features. "Didn't expect you would. I'm not asking you to work him now. I'm asking you to get him ready. I've got timber contracts starting in about 6 weeks. You get this horse healthy and strong by then, and the job is yours. I'll even advance you some money for feed and supplies to help you get him there." John felt his throat tighten. This was it. The miracle Martha had spoken of. The reason she'd said Goliath had come to them. But 6 weeks wasn't much time, and Goliath had a long way to go. The responsible thing would be to refuse, to not make promises he might not be able to keep. But desperation and hope warred within him, and hope won. "How much of an advance?" John asked quietly. Pete reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn wallet. $200, enough to buy quality feed, get him any medical supplies you need, maybe hire the vet to check him over. Consider it an investment in my future workhorse." He counted out the bills and held them out to John. John stared at the money, more cash than he'd seen in months. His hands trembled as he reached out to take it. "Pete, I don't know what to say. If he doesn't make it, if he can't do the work, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it," Pete interrupted. "I've been watching you, John. Everyone in this county has been watching you fail for the past 2 years. But the way you're handling this horse, the care you're giving him when you've got every reason to give up on everything, that tells me something. It tells me you're a man who doesn't quit. So I'm betting on you, and I'm betting on that horse." After Pete left, John stood in the barn holding the money, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. He walked to Goliath's stall and looked at the horse with new eyes. This wasn't just a creature he'd rescued out of compassion anymore. This was his family's salvation, their last chance, their only hope. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders, heavy but somehow strengthening. "You hear that, boy?" John said softly, reaching out to stroke Goliath's neck. "Looks like you're going to save us after all. But first, we need to get you strong. Really strong. Think you can do that?" Goliath turned his head and looked at John with those deep, intelligent eyes, and John felt that same connection he'd felt at the auction yard, that sense of understanding that transcended the barrier between human and animal. Whatever it took, however hard he had to work, John was going to make sure Goliath was ready. The next morning, John used part of Pete's advance to buy real feed from Henderson's store. The old man's eyes widened when John paid in cash, and John could see the questions forming, but he offered no explanation beyond a simple thank you. He loaded bags of quality oats, alfalfa hay, and supplements into his truck, each purchase made with careful consideration of what Goliath needed most. He also stopped by Doc Miller's veterinary practice on the edge of town. Doc Miller was semi-retired, mostly tending to pets these days, but he'd worked with horses in his younger years. John explained Goliath's condition and the plan, and the old veterinarian agreed to come by the next day to examine the horse and create a proper recovery program. When John returned home, Martha was sitting on the porch, wrapped in her quilt despite the afternoon heat. He told her everything about Pete's offer, about the advance, about the possibility that had opened up before them like a door they'd thought was locked forever. Martha's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you that horse came to us for a reason." The children helped John unload the feed, their faces bright with an excitement they'd been afraid to feel for months. Emma carefully measured out Goliath's portions according to the feeding plan John had devised, determined to help him gain weight steadily without overwhelming his system. James insisted on being the one to carry the water buckets, even though they were almost too heavy for him, his small face set with determination. That night, the Patterson family sat together at the dinner table for the first time in weeks with something other than despair seasoning their meal. They had food John had bought with the advance money, simple fare but more than they'd had in days. They had hope, fragile and tentative but real, and they had a plan, one that depended entirely on a broken horse regaining his strength and proving he was the giant his name proclaimed him to be. John looked at his family, at the faces of the people he loved more than life itself, and then his gaze drifted toward the barn where Goliath rested 6 weeks. That's all they had. 6 weeks to transform a dying horse into a working animal capable of heavy labor. 6 weeks to save everything. The work began in earnest the next morning. Doc Miller arrived just after sunrise, his ancient pickup rattling up the drive, with the same determination the old man himself possessed. He spent over an hour examining Goliath, running his experienced hands over every inch of the horse's body, checking teeth, listening to heart and lungs, assessing the damage done by months of abuse and neglect. When he finished, Doc Miller pulled John aside and spoke with the blunt honesty of someone who'd seen too much to sugarcoat the truth. "John, this horse has been through hell. He's malnourished, dehydrated, and those chains left wounds that could have gotten infected. His hooves are in terrible shape, probably haven't been properly trimmed in months. His back muscles are atrophied from carrying unbalanced loads, and I can feel old injuries that never healed right." John felt his hope crumbling, but Doc Miller wasn't finished. "That being said, this is one of the toughest animals I've ever seen. By all rights, he should be dead. The fact that he's not only alive but improving tells me he's got a will to survive that's stronger than his injuries. With proper care, good nutrition, and gradual conditioning, I believe he can make a full recovery. But it's going to take time, patience, and more work than you might be prepared for. Doc Miller left detailed instructions, medications for Goliath's wounds, supplements to add to his feed, and a schedule for gradually increasing his exercise. He refused to take payment beyond what was absolutely necessary for the medications, telling John that he was curious to see if this impossible recovery could actually happen. Over the following weeks, John's entire life revolved around Goliath. He rose before dawn every day to feed the horse, carefully measuring each portion, mixing in the supplements, ensuring Goliath ate steadily but not too quickly. After the morning feeding, he'd spend an hour grooming Goliath, brushing his coat until it began to show hints of the shine it had once possessed, carefully cleaning and treating the wounds left by the chains. Then came the exercise. At first, it was just walking, short distances around the barn area. Letting Goliath rebuild the muscle mass he'd lost, John walked beside him, one hand always on the horse's neck, talking to him constantly, encouraging him, telling him how strong he was becoming. Emma and James often joined these walks, the children fascinated by the gradual transformation taking place before their eyes. As the days passed, John began to notice changes. Goliath's ribs became less pronounced as healthy weight returned to his frame. His coat grew glossy, revealing the rich chestnut color that had been hidden beneath dirt and neglect. His eyes, once dull with pain and resignation, began to show alertness and intelligence. Most importantly, his gait improved, the limp from his injured legs fading as muscles strengthened and old wounds healed. But it wasn't just physical changes John observed. Goliath's entire demeanor transformed. The broken, defeated creature who'd barely been able to lift his head now stood tall, his massive frame radiating a dignity that spoke of noble bloodlines. He began to respond to John's voice, his ears pricking forward whenever he heard familiar footsteps, nickering softly in greeting when John entered the barn each morning. A bond formed between man and horse, something deeper than just owner and animal. They understood each other in ways that transcended words. When John was discouraged, feeling the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him, Goliath seemed to sense it, would nuzzle his shoulder gently as if offering comfort. When Goliath struggled with a particularly difficult exercise, seeming ready to give up, John's encouraging words would reach him, and the horse would try again. Martha, despite her illness, made the journey to the barn as often as she could, sitting on an old crate and watching John work with Goliath. One afternoon, as John led Goliath through a more challenging exercise routine, she called out to him, "You know what you're doing, don't you? You're not just training a horse, you're giving him back his purpose, his reason to be strong, just like he's giving you back yours." By the fourth week, John began introducing Goliath to actual work. He started with a light log, just a small piece of timber that Goliath could easily drag. The horse seemed confused at first, unused to being asked to pull something without the pain of chains and the cruelty of overwork. But John was patient, showing him that this was different, that this work came with praise and reward, not punishment and exhaustion. Goliath learned quickly. His breeding, his very nature, was designed for this kind of labor. And once he understood that John wouldn't hurt him, wouldn't demand more than he could give, the horse began to work with enthusiasm. He'd lean into the harness John had fashioned for him, muscles bunching beneath his glossy coat, pulling the logs with a strength that grew more impressive each day. Neighbors began to notice. Word spread about the dying horse John Patterson had bought for $5, about the impossible recovery taking place on the failing Patterson ranch. Some came by to see for themselves, standing at the fence and watching in amazement, as Goliath pulled loads that seemed impossible for a horse who'd been at death's door just weeks before. Pete Morrison visited regularly, checking on his investment, and each time he came, his respect for both horse and man grew more evident. On the morning of the 6th week, exactly 42 days after John had brought Goliath home, Pete arrived earlier than usual. He stood at the fence and watched as John put Goliath through his paces, the massive horse now pulling a substantial load of timber with ease, his powerful muscles rippling beneath a coat that gleamed in the early morning sun. When they finished, Pete walked over and ran his hand along Goliath's neck, nodding slowly. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete said quietly. "I had faith, but even I didn't think it was possible, John. This horse is ready. More than ready. He's magnificent." He pulled out his wallet and handed John a check. "That's for the first week of work. 7 days at $50 a day, $350. We start tomorrow if you're willing." John stared at the check, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. $350. More than enough to make the bank payment with money left over for food and Martha's medicine. He looked at Goliath, this giant who had come into his life when everything seemed lost, and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. That afternoon, John drove into town and walked into the bank with his head held high for the first time in months. The bank manager's surprise was evident when John handed him the payment, explaining that he had steady work now, that he'd be able to make his payments going forward. The man's expression shifted from skepticism to grudging respect, as John also paid the next month's payment in advance, insurance against any future uncertainty. From the bank, John went to the pharmacy and bought Martha's medications, the ones the doctor had prescribed months ago, but they'd been unable to afford. He bought good food, fresh vegetables and meat, things the children hadn't tasted in far too long. When he returned home, his arms full of packages, Emma and James ran to meet him, their faces glowing with a joy that made every moment of struggle worthwhile. Martha took her first dose of medicine that evening, and though John knew it would take time to see improvement, the simple act of being able to provide what she needed lifted a burden from his shoulders he'd carried for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. The next morning, John loaded Goliath into Pete's horse trailer, the massive animal walking up the ramp with confidence, trusting John completely. Before he closed the trailer door, John pressed his forehead against Goliath's neck and whispered, "Thank you, boy, thank you for saving us." The timber work proved to be exactly what Pete had promised. Goliath excelled at it, his strength and intelligence making him invaluable for hauling logs out of rough terrain where machines couldn't reach. Pete treated him well, never overworking him, always ensuring he had rest, food, and water. At the end of each workday, John would pick Goliath up and bring him home, spending the evening caring for him, making sure he remained healthy and strong. The money came steadily, week after week. John paid off the back debts that had been crushing him. He fixed the roof on the house, replaced the broken windows, bought new clothes for the children. Slowly, steadily, the ranch began to transform from a place of decay into a home again. But the most remarkable transformation was in Martha. The medications, combined with proper nutrition and the lifting of the crushing stress that had been slowly killing her, began to work. Color returned to her cheeks. She grew stronger, able to spend more time out of bed, able to help with household tasks again. The doctor, amazed by her recovery, told John that the medicine was only part of it. Hope, he said, was a powerful healer, and Martha had found her hope again. 4 months after John had spent his last $5 on a dying horse, the Patterson family gathered around the dinner table for a proper Thanksgiving meal. The table was laden with food they'd been able to afford. The house was warm and secure, and most importantly, they were together and healthy. James said grace, his young voice strong and clear, thanking God for Goliath and for second chances. After dinner, John walked out to the barn where Goliath stood in his stall, well-fed and content. The scars from his chains had faded to barely visible lines in his glossy coat. He was no longer the broken, dying creature John had found at that auction. He was powerful, magnificent, everything his name promised. "You know something, Goliath," John said softly, stroking the horse's neck. "Everyone thought I was crazy for buying you. They said I'd wasted my last $5 on a lost cause, but they didn't understand what I saw in your eyes that day. They didn't see what I saw, a fighter who refused to give up, a giant who was down but not defeated." Goliath nickered softly, his breath warm against John's hand. John continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us, boy. Not just with the money you helped us earn, though God knows we needed that. You saved us by reminding us what it means to keep fighting even when everything seems hopeless. You showed my children that compassion isn't foolish, that sometimes the craziest decisions are the right ones, that faith means believing in possibilities when all you can see are problems." He paused, looking into Goliath's dark, intelligent eyes. "I spent my last $5 on you, and you gave me back everything. My home, my family's future, my wife's health, my children's hope. But more than that, you gave me back myself. You reminded me who I am, who my father raised me to be, a man who doesn't quit, a man who sees value where others see waste, a man who knows that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the greatest risks." Spring came, and with it, new life burst forth across the Patterson ranch. The rains finally returned, and green shoots pushed up through soil that had been barren for so long. John stood in his fields with Goliath beside him, watching Emma and James play in the distance, while Martha, strong and healthy now, hung laundry in the sunshine. The giant had indeed saved them all.